Hey guys, welcome back. This week we're going to be talking about lasers. They're one of the most important emerging technologies right now in the real world. And in my opinion, they will absolutely shape the future of warfare here on Earth. Almost every nation is racing to build and develop weapons based off them. But when we look at Halo, the UNSC in particular, on the other hand, they almost never use lasers outside of a few different niche cases. So join me this week as we explore what exactly entails a laser weapon, and why or why not the UNSC may have chosen not to use them. When it comes to lasers in Halo, by far the Covenant use them the most. They use pulse laser turrets on their ships for point defense, and the reason being is there's several advantages. Particularly in space, there's no atmosphere to attenuate or obscure the laser energy. And lasers obviously move at the speed of light, which means that they're relatively instantaneous outside of long distances, allowing the Covenant to degrade or destroy UNSC vessels both quickly and at range. On the other hand, the UNSC has been relatively slow to develop and use any such weapons. We see the Spartan laser as early as Halo 3, using what appears to be a chemically induced laser that's clearly capable of destroying vehicles and personnel. But outside of that, it's not really seen too much. Later in Halo 4, we do see them use Pelicans armed with such weaponry, but as far as I know, that's the last time we really see those capabilities. And outside of those specific niche cases, we don't see lasers on the battlefield in significant amounts, not like I might expect. And the reason being is the way that the lore describes energy shielding. They can sustain serious abuse, but they're susceptible to energy-based weapons. This can actually be seen as a gameplay mechanic. If you look, plasma cuts through shields a lot better than kinetic weapons. So if you step back and knowing this, there's little reason to assume that laser-based weapons of sufficient power would not do any more different and would have a better effect than kinetic methods when we talk about taking out energy shields. Now, I don't say that this should necessarily mean that the UNSC should only use lasers, but I think there is room for some very interesting hybrid and tandem warhead style approaches combining conventional weapons that the UNSC already uses as well as lasers to have a devastating effect on the Covenant. But to understand that, first we need to step back and talk about lasers. How do we use them today, and why do I think that they would be relevant? Well, they're an emerging technology. For all we know, in 10 to 20 years, this may be an ice cold take, and lasers won't be relevant. They may be dumped by the wayside due to their drawbacks. But in my opinion, what's more likely is they could easily define warfare for the rest of our lives. Right now, just about every major military power is researching and developing lasers as weapons. And beyond just direct applications, they exist in several forms, both experimental and actual use. So what exactly is a laser weapon then? Well, for starters, lasers exist both on a literal and figurative spectrum. Figuratively, as a weapon, no nation currently fields them in sufficient numbers as a standalone system. What I mean is, you're not seeing anyone running around with a laser on the back of a truck, straight up turning people to ash like War of the Worlds. Most countries, most notably the United States, our allies, do rely heavily on lasers as a way to guide weapons and communicate. And most of these are infrared, and they're like the pointers you see on the end of weapons, communicating location information both informally, aka using the Mark 1 eyeball to see someone else's pointer, automatically through computer systems, being able to track and capture laser spots, as well as designating points for targets for a missile or a bomb to impact. But outside of those specific cases, like I said, we're not seeing the really cool stuff, not just yet. And that's where the other spectrum comes in. Lasers exist on the visual spectrum, electromagnetic spectrum, more specifically, obviously. And infrared, while it's good, particularly because it's not visible to the naked eye, allowing you to communicate information against an adversary without those capabilities, without it being seen. But there's also the visible spectrum, which is, the laser pointers you can get at the store. But there's also ultraviolet and X-ray lasers of a higher energy kind of component. And this is kind of like the area of interest that's being developed right now, is not using lasers solely as a designator, but actually to straight up destroy things. Starting all the way back in the early 1970s, the US actually looked into using nuclear pumped X-ray lasers to destroy incoming nuclear missiles. The rough idea was you would detonate a nuclear bomb in orbit, and you would have rods placed around the explosion that when they absorbed all of that energy, they would emit heavily in the X-ray spectrum. And you could then point these during the detonation at an incoming missile, and it would cause it to heat and eventually detonate itself. itself. Now granted, this project was ultimately never put into development, mostly because it's pretty wild to be, nuclear powered lasers. But the idea didn't stop there. In the early to late 2000s, the US was also developing the YAL-1 testbed. This was a 747 modified with a laser in the nose meant to destroy nuclear missiles from range while they were in their launch and boost phase, their most vulnerable phase. Despite having lasers to do so, they were using chemical lasers, it was heavy and cumbersome. So they took a look at maybe using electrical means. But the issue there was that the electrical means to power and put on an aircraft just wasn't practical yet. And so ultimately the test bed was disassembled. That said, several similar projects would come and go over the coming years. Particularly, the US, Europe, Israel's a big one with their Iron Dome system, Russia, and big time China. But ultimately none of these have been fielded yet. The closest thing we have right now are lasers meant for close-in protection against things like small drones, or for blinding people. I know the US in particular is getting very close to being able to field lasers on ships, as well as on vehicles to defeat things like quadcopters, what we're seeing in the Russian-Ukraine war that's having such a massive impact on the battlefield. But I feel like we're getting close. We're very, very close to getting to that magical point where lasers stop being experimental, and they go on to destroy things like aircraft, incoming missiles, protecting boats, troops, the list goes on. I know there's even projects out there about using lasers on aircraft to destroy targets on the ground. And this isn't just, theoretical. It's actually, going through some demos and trials. But to understand why it is that it's still experimental, we have to talk about the drawbacks. And this is important too when we talk about it being useful in Halo. And largely the drawbacks we face today with lasers as weapon lies mostly with atmospherics. In particular, there's a phenomenon called thermal blooming, which is pretty much any sufficiently powerful laser will cause the atmosphere, the actual gas around us, to break down into plasma, which distorts the beam. This is, especially pronounced in cases of obscure targets due to smoke, mist, rain. This is also why, in my previous video talking about orbital defense platforms, I said the ones around Reach being powered by ground stations was impractical. And a lot of people brought up well, you could just use microwave or some other form of energy transmission to the atmosphere. Well, no, unfortunately, there's a point where too much energy will cause the atmosphere to begin to ionize. But there are some proposed methods to avoid this. There's the kind of rat shit old school idea of basically taking several lasers on a almost parabolic array, and that way the individual lasers are not causing the atmosphere to bloom, but they all coalesce on a single point, delivering lethal amounts of energy. But this is, big, and you would have to have a huge kind of like parabolic mirror almost style design that would have to track and follow a target. So another one that's been proposed is extremely similar to what we have with radars today, is a phased array. And what this means is you have a flat panel that would emit laser energy, but each little antenna or transmitter, more or less, of that laser energy could be steered in a specific direction. And so instead of having a single laser defeating the target, now you have several smaller, lesser powered lasers that would combine on a single point, potentially avoiding the thermal blooming problem. You might be telling yourself what you're hearing is that lasers are cool but not effective. And that's true, but only today. In my opinion, I feel like there is sufficient evidence that I personally believe it's only a matter of time before lasers become the dominant form of warfare here. And that's because a lot of these problems like thermal blooming, it's very close to being overcome. And when we talk about it applying to Halo, there's a significant number of advantages that the UNSC has that we don't. Particularly the fact that, we're not in space. Lasers don't have the drawbacks of atmospheric blooming. Even in atmosphere, the UNSC has access to technology that we don't. And really that can amplify the destructive capability of laser weapons. For instance, there is a concept called the electrolaser. It's theoretical today, and we've actually demonstrated in some capabilities. The idea is you would use a sufficiently powerful laser to intentionally create thermal blooming. You would ionize the atmosphere. Plasma is a very good conductor of electricity, and then using that corridor, more or less, you would discharge a vast amount of electricity through it to the target. And so the kill mechanism here is not necessarily the laser energy, even though it'd probably be very uncomfortable to be hit with a laser that powerful, but the massive amounts of electricity being discharged, it'd be more or less a beam of lightning, if that makes sense. You'd be delivering obscene amounts of power. And that's something, the UNSC clearly could do. The benefits there is it would be near instantaneous effects against targets, much like how plasma weapons are shown to be, but not necessarily realistically how they would actually work in the real world. Another application that would be really, really beneficial for the UNSC, and as I mentioned earlier, we know that lasers and directed energy weapons have a stronger effect against energy shielding. The UNSC could use this to great effect through tandem warheads, or really just combining conventional weaponry with lasers. For instance, you could have a small precursor thermonuclear munition ahead of, say, either a missile or a MAC round. You launch them together and they just separate while they're in flight towards the target. This small munition could detonate, having a casing preventing it from, distributing its energy away from the ship. Obviously, you want it to go towards the Covenant ship, and then using that and those, thick solid rods, so to speak, to pump to generate an X-ray laser, much like I was talking about with Project Excalibur in the 1970s. And so you would generate a very quick but powerful flash of energy into the energy shielding of the Covenant ship, disrupting it and degrading it. The idea is not necessarily to strip the entire ship of shields, but really just to disturb it in that localized area, so that the MAC round that is immediately following, and I'm talking about like fractions of seconds. This would not be, one into the other spread over time. Instead, it would be a flash of X-ray energy to disturb the shield, and then that way there's no resistance, and the MAC round can just slide straight in, distributing all of its kinetic energy into the Covenant ship. This type of concept isn't necessarily new. That's actually how, more or less, we defeat reactive armor on tanks today when it comes to anti-tank guided munitions. Overall though, I always thought it was odd that we don't see more lasers in Halo. Granted, it kind of does make sense because you have to keep in mind, it is a science fiction game at the end of the day, and CE was being made in the late 90s, very early thousands, when lasers, were kind of a gimmick on keychains. There was still some applications there in the military that were being talked about, but we weren't seeing them emerge as a potential weapon system like we are today. And right now, we're limited by our technology, but the UNSC is not. And so it's, in my opinion, very easy and relatively fun to theorize how they could combine such weapons, tools that we're developing right now, to better serve them in their fight, what was against the Covenant and currently against the Banished. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this video. It was a blast to make. Take care, be safe, enjoy the weekend. I'll see you guys later.